The people putting their hands up do not reflect the diversity of the people in this hall, and that is very clear to me. I am afraid, and I'm not speaking from a position of particular strength here, there are too many white men putting their hands up.
The compassion the Labour Party once had for its traditional supporters borders on contempt a century on from its birth. This trend has festered for decades. It was confined to those that are British, or certainly English, definitely white, but there's been a shift this century. It's now directed towards anyone that doesn't toe the party line on particular issues. Minority topics have replaced pressing issues once synonymous with the party and beneficial to the majority. Labour spent years highlighting these. In government, it made headway in tackling them: housing, education, health, employment. In the modern Labour Party, these finish a poor second, behind facile themes central to identity politics. And so, for the first time in its history, Labour is the party of middle-class graduates and professionals, as was apparent following the last general election and the recent council elections. It's now the party of London, at least the capital's affluent liberal middle class and poorer ethnic minorities, from Westminster to Whitechapel. But it has failed to win back northern voters in the Red Wall, which turned blue in 2019. It's therefore unlikely to have sufficient MPs to become the majority party and form a government at the next general election, after losing the last 4 and being in opposition for 12 years. Will Labour once again become a party for the many rather than the few?
Here in London, the Mayor, Labour councillors and Labour MPs concern themselves with removing statues and removing names from streets, rather than the crime carried out on those streets. Will those who censor and counsel one day come for their Labour comrades that made their way onto plimps and plaques but no longer make the grade?
Keir Hardie had an issue with immigrants. Clement Attlee had an issue with homosexuality. Anthony Wedgwood Benn had an issue with the EU, possibly now the greatest crime of all to many on the left. It's not therefore just history that's been rewritten, as street names, buildings and statues come under the scrutiny of current groupthink, but class, gender and race too. Identity politics doesn't build on past legislation that brought change, which the left championed and Labour implemented in government from the 1960s. That so-called liberal hour during which homosexuality and abortion were legalised, divorce laws reformed, the Race Relations Act introduced. The modern left doesn't erase this part of the past, it desecrates it by failing to acknowledge the progress that's led to an enlightened present.
Battles almost won are reignited. Remits are widened to keep the grievances burning, like the streets and the looted buildings, and the flags on the cenotaph during the chaos and violence of the BLM summer last year.
The pursuit of equality has been supplanted by a demand for equity. Ethnic minority status trumps merit to deliver a cosmetic diversity. Failure to achieve quotas is attributable to white privilege and systemic racism, so the mantra goes. Gay rights, the women's movement, are superseded by transgender activism and an LGBTQA lobby that alienates gays
and infringes on the lives of biological women. Those responsible for rewriting the remit on race, history and gender are now setting their sights on class. During the 2019 general election, not so young but privileged Labour supporters declared that older working class city dwellers that shipped out and became homeowners were more entitled than young, privately educated graduates renting in the capital. It's a subject that neither their pedigree nor their degrees prepared them for. Anyone with lived experience knows that class is not where you end up, it's where you start out. It was an indication of how much Labour and the left have moved away from the outlook and the policies they were previously associated with. The story of the Labour Party begins and continues with a man named Keir. The current leader, Keir Starmer, was named after Keir Hardie, one of the founding fathers of the party and its original leader. But is that where the similarities start or end? Hardie believed in democracy, women's suffrage, national borders. He was wary of the impact of immigration. Starmer attempted to reverse Brexit, is unable to define what a woman is, leads a party of MPs that rally for open borders. This, at least, is the view of his critics.
Shouting slogans or changing lives conference.
Keir Starmer says he wants to change lives and not chant slogans. But at the moment it seems the party is just left with the chants and the slogans so as to appeal to its base of middle-class professionals, students and graduates. Environmentalism is the issue of the day when it's a slow week for racism. There's the demonisation of whitey, the canonisation of everyone else. Legislation to bolster transgenderism and ban misogyny, making it easier for a man to call himself a woman and harder for a man to catcall a woman. There's little evident opposition to any of this within the Labour movement. When it comes to dealing with those that have a different take on these issues, whether inside or outside the party, the consensus is to counsel, to censor, or to just silence them. In Batley, Yorkshire, the Labour MP Kim Ledbetter was elected by a reduced margin in 2021. This followed in the wake of protests at the local grammar school, where a teacher showed images of the Prophet Muhammad in the class. The teacher went into hiding and remains in hiding.
The use of these materials was done in a deliberate, threatening and provocative manner.
The party tread carefully over these events so as not to be accused of Islamophobia, a charge it's been quick to level at others. Its response to the many complaints of anti-Semitism it was accused of when Jeremy Corbyn was leader was to accuse the Conservative government of Islamophobia. Ultimately, the Equality and Human Rights Commission investigated and delivered a report that detailed the party's failings in dealing with these charges. In short, a quango within the state-funded empire that the grievance industry has become, and which Labour helped create, had turned on it. Labour has fared no better when dealing with both women's issues and the crimes against women feminists have campaigned to draw attention to. We can't forget the Pakistani grooming gangs raping white girls in too many northern cities to list, but the Labour Party would like us to. Not only were these not addressed, but there were attempts to silence the reports and the rape victims themselves. Not all in the Labour movement were culpable, but the silence of the most vocal on these crimes and issues was itself a revelation. Or maybe it wasn't, as it's now the official line. The few female Labour MPs to speak out
were silenced or sidelined. Some believe that the victims themselves should have remained silent. The Right Honourable Naz Shah liked to tweet from a fake account suggesting rape victims should keep quiet for the sake of multiculturalism. Similarly, women are sidelined or silenced when fighting their corner as transgender activists insult them on social media and attempt to infiltrate their spaces. At least we're clear of how some male Labour figures feel about the women with these concerns. MP David Lammy described them as dinosaurs. It's not surprising that Labour is losing female voters, just as it lost Jewish voters under Jeremy Corbyn. Meanwhile, the North London Labour MP and mother, Stella Creasy, struggles to turn the House of Commons into a creche and documents her struggle regularly on social media. Perhaps this is another reason why #LabourLosingWomen is often trending on Twitter, a place where you're more likely to see MPs these days than Parliament. What does this say about the calibre of the MPs in the House of Commons back there in Westminster? In the Prime Minister we have the relics of privilege that belong to another age. Eton, Bullingdon Club, a belief that he was born to rule, but with the ambition but not the ability required for the post. A modern form of privilege persists on the opposition benches, where minority status is the necessary pedigree, that which propels characters into safe seats and often the shadow cabinet, without talent, skill, merit being a priority. These figures stand on the shoulders of giants, those that found their way onto plaques and plinths and the names above entrances on buildings. Something that's unlikely to happen with the current breed of Labour MPs. Although it does seem that some appear to be worthy.
Well, the idea that we should have a policy on on issues in relation to ordinary issues in relation to.
It's not just the calibre of Labour MPs that's changed, it's the demographic that Labour now appeals to. The party that was established to represent the working class is now the party of the South, of the middle class professional, of the graduate, in big cities and university towns. This was evident following the 2019 election. The red wall of the North turned blue, electing Tory MPs in seats long held by Labour. The party's worst defeat since 1935. Conservatives were more popular with low-income households than wealthy ones for the first time ever. The exodus has been in the offing for years, under different leaders, and for numerous reasons. It reached its apogee in 2019. Blair said that one of the Labour traditions that he hated most was that of losing elections. The Labour Party has now lost 4 of them. Historically, the Tories have been a party exhausted by government, Labour exhausted by opposition. Division within Labour ranks was often a factor. The party now has to bridge another divide. How to court the middle class left and coax back working class voters. Will it ditch the hobbies that lead young posh people to pull down statues and old posh people to glue their faces to motorways, and prioritise the policies that defined its significant moments in office? Can it embrace its history and learn from it instead of erasing it or rewriting it? Keir Hardie was a Scottish trade unionist.
He stood as an independent here in the East End in 1892 and became a local MP. Later he became the leader of the Parliamentary Labour Party for 3 years, 6 years after the party was formed in 1900.
Hardy's generalised socialism was closer to Christ than Marx. He preached the word beyond the party faithful. Not solely a proletariat that struggled for a voice in the Victorian era and rallied for the vote in the Edwardian age. Hardy recognised the working classes were not socialists by instinct. Not all were trade unionists or labour supporters. The movement included trade unionists and upper-class Fabians, those behind the 19 Constitution, with its sacred Clause 4 principle, the common ownership of industry.
The question who are the working class is becoming as relevant now as it was back when the party started, particularly as class itself, or the interpretation of class, is now being recast. Social anthropologists discovered one theme common to the working class was patriotism, something that was dismissed as xenophobia and nationalism, something to be mocked.
Can we forget Islington-based Emily Thornberry tweeting that image while campaigning in Rochester during a 2014 by-election?
There's a deeper aspect to this patriotism that goes beyond any nationalistic overtones. A collective memory, an attachment to community, and the insularity, the folklore, and the localism that springs from that experience.
These communal elements, once celebrated by the Labour Party, were later cumbersome when immigration and multiculturalism were regarded as a threat to established communities. Working class patriotism remains an anathema to Labour Remainers, to that contingent on the left who were seemingly anti-British, anti-Western, and by way of a chaser, anti-white. Labour tapped into patriotism on the eve of an election, if at all. Peter Mandelson embracing a British bulldog just before Tony Blair triumphed. The crass immigration marks from Ed Miliband's campaign. When Keir Starmer got off his knee as the Black Lives Matter circus left town, wasn't he photographed in front of a Union Jack?
Clement Attlee was a leader that didn't have a problem with patriotism, having served in a coalition government with the Conservatives during World War II. Ernest Bevin, a minister in Attlee's government, once described as the greatest trade unionist of his generation, once said that the most conservative man in Britain was the British trade unionist.
Attlee described Bevin as first and foremost a great Englishman. He understood the people of this country which he loved, and I believed he interpreted the British idea with great fidelity.
From the off, Labour voters didn't adhere to the internationalism and the radicalism of their socialist counterparts and fellow travellers overseas. Representation and reform were favoured over revolution.
Conference in 1945, our party put forward a manifesto called "Let Us Face the Future."
As a result of the balloting, final tabulations delayed for 3 weeks by the soldier vote, the British people have repudiated Churchill's defence of free enterprise.
For its apparatchiks, the party's high watermark is the post-war Attlee government, the landslide victory of 1945 that introduced radical social reforms in housing, welfare and employment that resonate today.
Clement Attlee was privately educated and from the upper middle classes. His outlook shifted to the left when he worked among the poor here in the East End. He became a local MP and later the longest serving leader of the Labour Party, 20 years from 1935.
Both the man and his government had become the stuff of myth and legend because of the impact of the policies in the offing for years which Labour acted on. Naturally, the plaudits overlooked the shortcomings of the vision, the view that ultimately this was a wasted period for economic growth that would have benefited the nation. Decades later, historian Corelli Barnett
was less diplomatic about Labour's legacy. A dream turned to a dank reality of a segregated, subliterate, unskilled, unhealthy and institutionalised proletariat hanging on the nipple of state maternalism. But this was a government, a Labour Party, that understood the needs of the working class and were aware of who they were. A health service for Britons which didn't anticipate the health tourism of later years and the bloated bureaucratic monolith the NHS would become. Social housing for those with local ties, built on a fair point system, rather than one based on need, which Labour later introduced, leaving the system open to abuse and broken, even before the Tories' big sell-off in the 1980s, which long-standing working-class tenants benefited from. One self-evident fact about the Attlee administration, from historians on the left, was it was the end, rather than the beginning, of socialism. The adherence to nationalism to Clause 4 had not delivered what it promised. The public's lack of support for it played a part in the Tory victory of 1951. It was the moment the middle-class radical became identified with the Labour Party, a figure the former Minister and London Mayor Herbert Morrison was the first to identify. Here was a demographic that might replenish the waning working-class vote.
Herbert Morrison was a London native, proud of the city, its monuments, its statues and its people.
And that's one of the ugly ones. Now I get a thrill out of this because it's the street in which I was brought up for the greater part of my life as a boy from 5 years old, having been born in Brixton. It is Mordaunt Street, Stockwell. A typical street of the 1880s and the 1890s. They were a mixed population, but neighbourly folk. I was very happy with them and had good times. And you see, here are some more, still neighbourly, still friendly. Hadn't seen me there for years, if they'd seen me at all, but they knew me, and they gave me a kindly reception. And indeed, Londoners have been very good to me, and still are, and I value that friendship.
Herbert Morrison was largely the mastermind behind the Festival of Britain, staged here on the South Bank in 1951. The Royal Festival Hall is the last thing to remain from that exhibition. I suppose it's a relic from a vision of the future from a distant past.
One writer later described the new Labour voting metropolitan class that championed the festival as the herbivores, readers of The Observer, viewers of the BBC. The carnivores were the archaic, conservative establishment, its nemesis.
The group that were most overlooked and unnamed were working class Britons, who suffered the most during the post-war years of austerity and rationing, and were stunned by the cost of the exhibition.
That's not to say they didn't feature among the new towns and the feats in design that were a clue to the nation of tomorrow. The Rosie Lee Cafe was an East End outpost festival visitors could reach by boat along the Thames to sample the Cockney life of a London that was receding into the past. The Cockneys were as much a caricature as the cloth-capped Northerners to the Labour voting herbivores. In his few years as leader, Keir Starmer has said, the more we expose the inadequacy of this government, the more it presses the question back on us. If they're so bad, what does it say about us? This applies to numerous times the party's been in opposition. When Labour formed its first government in the 1920s, the Annual Register, the ancient annual take on politics, heralded it as a revolution in British politics, as profound as that associated with the Reform Act of 1832. 2 decades later, it noted that Labour had been in opposition longer than any political party since the Reform Act of 1832.
During the wilderness years between 1951 and 1964, after Hugh Gaitskell replaced Clement Attlee as Labour Party leader,
The party seemed to be torn over the issue of Clause 4 and lost for ideas. It seemed to have lost sight of who its working class voters were. It was applying a 1918 constitution to a working class of the 1930s in the 1950s. Many may not have had it as good as the Conservative government maintained, but primary poverty had been eliminated, full employment attained. Radical reform introduced under Attlee to bring about these goals had not been repealed under the Tories. What had changed was the working class Labour voter. The railway, the proliferation of social housing, the rise of the suburbs had brought change. Technology and consumerism further altered the working class outlook, if not the culture and the work. The left took the Engels line that affluence had made the masses apathetic. They'd forsaken the revolution for a fridge on HP. Some Labour MPs believed working class Britons were socialists at heart who needed to be exposed to how rotten capitalism was. Starmer's line, "What does it say about us?" also resonates with the 1980s, when the party began to surpass its previous record of years in opposition. In 1979, more trade unionists voted Conservative than at any time in the movement's history. In 1983, party leader Michael Foot campaigned with a manifesto described by skeptics as the longest suicide note in history. Party veterans had absconded to become the nucleus of the nascent Social Democrats in reaction to the party's step towards the left. The militant tendency had infiltrated the movement but failed to take over the show, when Neil Kinnock took the helm and headed them off at the pass.
The voice of the real people with real needs is louder than all the boos that can be assembled. Understand that, please, comrades, in your socialism, in your commitment to those people. Understand it.
Where militant failed, momentum succeeded this century, with the election of Jeremy Corbyn, and a manifesto tailored to a middle-class student population, or middle-class radicals who, like the party leader, dragged the politics of their youth into middle age.
Look at my face, look at every female member of parliament for the Labour Party, look at every single black, Asian and ethnic minority Labour member of parliament. The idea that we stand quietly by and deliver you a future contest that is pale, male and stale, you're having a laugh. It ain't going to happen, folks.
A party that prides itself on its diversity, a party that failed to elect one female leader, let alone two, found its socialist saviour in a prep school educated member of the middle classes, maybe the upper middle classes, an elderly white man named Jeremy. The manifesto was the most left-wing since the 1983 document, with a major difference. In 1983, it stipulated Britain's withdrawal from the European Union without a referendum. This was in keeping with the historic hostility to the former EEC from veteran left-wingers Michael Foot, Barbara Castle and Anthony Wedgwood Benn.
Fear that we've somehow been so reduced as a country that we can no longer, as it were, totter about in the world independent as a nation. And a constant attrition of our morale, a constant attempt to tell us that what we have, and what we have is not only our own achievement, but what generations of Englishmen have helped us to achieve, is not worth a damn.
It was the stance of young left-wingers like Jeremy Corbyn, who appeared to switch sides in time for the 2016 referendum. The Labour Party has been out of power for 12 years and in power 13 times in the last century. This is a comment on the party itself rather than the electorate. When it comes to understanding why voters have defected to other parties or opted for apathy and not voted at all, the left tends to avoid introspection and resorts to name-calling. We've seen it in the past with Gordon Brown's encounter with Gillian Duffy, the obligatory name-calling, We see it on social media now. While many Labour MPs have trouble defining an anti-Semite or a woman, others have no trouble in defining a racist or a xenophobe. By levelling these charges so freely, the left often comes across more parochial and outmoded than those they are targeting or trolling. The charges of racism from the left began in earnest in the 1960s under the premiership of Harold Wilson, when the white working class began to fear the impact of mass immigration on neighbourhoods. It was a fear of what might happen in the future rather than what was happening at the time. It was a question of numbers. The Labour Party attempted to bridge this divide by putting the brakes on the number of immigrants arriving and introducing legislation to protect those already here from encountering prejudice when pursuing homes and work. It was a season of student uprising and insurrection, the bonfire of restrictive legislation that would improve the lot of minorities, whether black, gay or female. The liberal hour was saying goodbye to the carnivores as well as the conservative-minded parochial working class. Eventually, in the place of the cartoon northerner and the cartoon cockney came another caricature. Essex man of the 80s, Mondeo man of the 90s. The masses were once again accused of opting for consumerism and apathy over revolution. Only this time, it wasn't just a fridge, but a car, a mortgage, a house, maybe two. Whatever the insults levelled at these characters, they pale beside those that were later aimed at working class voters who supported Brexit. Harold Wilson's government had reached out to the managerial class, celebrated progress, new technology, in order to return to power. Working class voters returned, as they did throughout the years, because as Labour MPs would often comment, they had nowhere else to go. In its bid to be the party, the government of progress under Harold Wilson, the Labour government applied to join what is now the European Union in 1967. In 1975, in order to bring together a divided party, Wilson held a referendum on whether to stay or leave the European community. The nation voted to remain. In 2016, Tory Prime Minister David Cameron did something similar for similar reasons. The youngest of those eligible to vote in 1975 were now in their 60s. Younger generations voted. The nation opted to leave.
The British people have spoken and the answer is we're out.
During the campaign, the tragic murder of Labour MP Jo Cox occurred in her constituency in West Yorkshire. A British white man with right-wing sympathies was responsible, so it was quickly classified as an act of terrorism, with mental illness and the lone wolf motif immediately removed. Everyone that voted Brexit was in the dock, with blood on their hands. Evidence included the lack of a university degree, few, if any, O-levels. The working class Leave supporter, Labour or Tory, was too ignorant to vote apparently. It was the 19th century revisited. Antipathy towards the European Union had been building for decades. One development that added to this was when the EU welcomed more members in 2004. Britain became one of the few countries to offer an open-door policy. Tony Blair's Labour government got the numbers wrong. They anticipated an annual 5,000 new arrivals and got 80,000. Was the assumption they would fill manual roles and boost the Labour vote. Keir Starmer's predicament has been compared to that of other party leaders in the past, but which ones? Is he the point Tony Blair was when he decided to overhaul the party and give it a new name? Is he like Hugh Gateskill leading a party that keeps losing elections? Will he, like Harold Wilson, take office from a Tory party exhausted by government and burdened by scandal? The Tories have failed to act on the goodwill of the northern cities that turned the Red Wall blue. They failed to apply the draconian laws they imposed on the public during the pandemic to the high command of their inner circle. Keir Starmer has been compared to Neil Kinnock, having the thankless task of ridding the party of extremists. Kinnock himself has dismissed the comparison. He says, "I think it is more Attlee than Kinnock. Attlee had 3 or 4 years in which to demonstrate his trustworthiness as the leader in government. Keir is going to have to do it without getting that." But evidently there was more to Attlee than trustworthiness. He possessed other qualities lacking in the current cabinet and shadow cabinet. As Kinnock's rival in the 1980s, Margaret Thatcher, said in retirement, "Of Clement Attlee I was an admirer. He was a serious man and a patriot. Quite contrary to the general tendency of politicians in the 1990s, he was all substance and no show." Margaret Thatcher also said there was no such thing as society, only individuals and families. The Wilson government promoted a civilised society rather than the permissive society they were saddled with. John Major wanted a classless society, New Labour an aspirational society, David Cameron a big society. Keir Starmer calls for a contribution society. However ambitious Keir Starmer's vision when it comes to changing lives, changing the Labour Party, or changing the supporters of the Labour Party, it seems the policies that stay in the minds of the electorate are those relating to slogans and chants. These appeal to the few and alienate the many. Judging by the current state of things, if the working class Labour voter returns to the fold and returns the party to government, it won't be because of these policies, it will be by default. It will be because of an exhausted and inadequate Conservative government rather than an invigorated and proficient Labour opposition. It will be because, as Labour MPs have pointed out in the past, they have nowhere else to go.